according to many historians, ever. It has impacted nations. It has changed people's lives. And every time I go through this book, my understanding of the entire Bible increases. As you know, it was written by the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul is perhaps one of the most unique individuals who God called to share the gospel in the early church. First off, he was, as he said, a Pharisee of a Pharisee. He was trained in the best schools, the Hebrew schools and the Roman schools. In fact, many claim that he was a genius. He was definitely a literary genius. And his insights that he gives us through all of his writings are truly, truly masterfully done. And the book of Romans is one of his greatest masterpieces. So, let's jump right in. Just as a way of quick review, the first 8 chapters of the book of Romans are, we kind of look at them as doctrinal, focused on what we might call faith. These 8 chapters deals with the topic of sin, deals with the topic of salvation, and most importantly, sanctification. In fact, many claim it is the most complete diagnosis of the topic of sin in the entire Bible. Then the next 3 chapters, we focus on Israel. Some call this the 911. And it wraps up dealing with some very practical issues that Paul shares with his friends and to us. Now, we've already covered chapter 9. Last time he was here, we were in chapter 10, and we did not a totally detailed, but we did an overview of the history of Israel, because we were looking at Israel in its present. So we wanted to get a history of how they got to where they are. Now, I'm not going to do a review of chapter 10, but I do want to pick up a point that I sort of ended with about a month ago when we were in chapter 10. Because we need to recognize that if you want to understand today, you do need to understand history. In fact, George Hegel said, history teaches us that man learns nothing from history. Because if you don't look at history, or you forget it, when we see similar cycles, we get caught in the same traps. So, I was talking about a country called Czechoslovakia. You may say, well, what has Czechoslovakia got to do with Israel? You probably, if you can go back a month from when I started this, you may remember that I said there are parallels between Czechoslovakia way back then and Israel today. So I want to quickly review that. Before Hitler came into power, Czechoslovakia had an army of about 800,000 strong. These were crack soldiers. Many don't know it, but during this time, Czechoslovakia was the leading country when it came to the development of arms. In other words, weaponry. They were highly advanced. They were protected by what they call the Sudeten Mountains. It protected their heartland and it protected their capital. In fact, many of the military experts of that day considered Czechoslovakia to be almost impregnable. To add to that, they had treaties that should have protected them even further. They had treaties with France, for instance. At that time, France had 100 divisions. They were larger than Germany. They had treaties with Britain and Russia. All of them guaranteed that if someone were to attack Czechoslovakia, they would be there for them. So I'm sure we would agree that Czechoslovakia at this time should have been a force to be reckoned with. And if you want to, sometimes if you cannot, overcome someone with brute force, what do? Well, I'll tell you what Hitler did. He started a propaganda campaign. See, in the Sudetenland, there were 3 million Germans and 7 million others. In other words, the German population was about 30% during that time. The Czechoslovakia then was very prosperous. They had, for all intents and purposes, full civil rights. As far as nations go, they were in a good place. They were pretty strong. There was no real civil unrest going on. So this is what Hitler did. He set up a puppet political leadership called the Sudeten Free Corps. Then what he did was he fabricated this Czech terror program. In other words, he fabricated the idea that the Czechs were committing terrorist acts against the Germans, the poor Germans. And he created something that we see today, you call the reversal of causality. So he created this propaganda campaign, and all of a sudden the news medias were filled, and the word went out that the intransigent Czechs were an obstacle to peace. So all of a sudden, there's this propaganda campaign going out. The Czechs are an obstacle to peace because they are coming against the poor Sudeten Germans. The news was saying they were precipitating a crisis to prevent the breakup of their state. The choice between war and peace was in the hands of the Czechs. The petty segment of Europe is harassing the human race. They went so far as to say that the Czechs were harassing the human race. Now, they weren't doing any of this. It was a pure fabrication. It was a media campaign. Then it became this mantra that the Western powers should force the Czechs to relinquish, now listen to this term, occupied territories. Has anyone heard the term occupied territories today? So Hitler, Hitler was smart. He manufactured a particular point of view. Well, 1937 to 38, the Czechs were pressured by leading Western powers to meet Sudeten demands. The Western press laments the Czechs' disregard for peace in Europe, injustice for not allowing Sudeten to be returned to Germany. Now, hold on for a minute. Sudetenland never belonged to Germany. It belonged to Czechoslovakia. But the media campaign all of a sudden began to shift things, and the world began to come to the crazy understanding that the Sudetenland belonged to Germany. There's a parallel going on today. The British, who were supposed to be, their allies, began to demand that the Czechs remodel foreign relations to assure freedom from aggressive action against their neighbors. In other words, they began to blackmail them, their allies. Around 1938, the British and the French determined that the Czechs must accede to Hitler's demands for the maintenance of peace and the safety of Czechoslovakia's vital interests. In other words, things that now all of a sudden, this fabricated misdirection has become part of public cry. So now the international community is getting involved, and there's this guarantee of new boundaries. If not, if they did not agree to these new boundaries, the international community is saying, then the Czechoslovakia will be alone. The treaties will no longer be honored. It said Neville Chamberlain at that time, it's recorded that he said, it's up to the Czechs now. Then this is when the sting operation took place. Because as over time, hysteria began to mount. Shuttle diplomacy begins to increase. Minutes before his 28 deadline, Hitler agreed to, now Hitler is agreeing to Chamberlain's proposal for a peace conference. This was the Munich conference. Britain and France pled, now things have changed dramatically in a very short period of time. Britain and France plead with Hitler for 11 hours to take the annexation followed by more demands. Violence and oppression continued. By 1939, the Nazi war machine rolled through the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Western powers, guess what? Their allies, guess what they did? Nothing. Their assurances proved worthless. Israel, democracy with a powerful army and defensive terrain. It's very similar to Czechoslovakia. In fact, direct seizure of Israel is pretty much unthinkable. Many have tried, doesn't work. They're receiving pressure from the West to give up land. In other words, we're seeing a reversal of causality. We're seeing where this group that, and I, for some reason my mind went blank, but they have these tents right outside of Israel, Palestinians, that Israel has taken the land from the Palestinians. Complete fabrication. When you have a managed press and an illiterate electorate, people can be controlled and manipulated. So we have a very similar situation taking place in Israel, but I want to point something out. Israel is a very critical country, and as we go through chapter 11, we're going to be pointing this out more and more. The United States has been Israel's ally. Remember what was the first textbook that Congress mandated for the public schools? Exactly. Now, as long as, whether they agreed with it or not, if you are being trained in the Bible from a young age, everybody, now, I know the world won't agree with me, but the intellectual level of everybody increases. Many marveled at the intellectual level of the United States, and it was primarily, people don't realize this, they won't recognize, they think it's because you can pump all the money into the public schools you want. But if you don't have that Bible as a foundation, okay, people can be manipulated, history can be distorted. The one thing about the Bible, it doesn't change. And its truth endureth forever. And when you remove that, all of a sudden, generations begin to come about in the United States that don't have that foundation. To the point in a 2000, I think it was it 2008, but the second election cycle of Obama, the Democratic convention literally voted to not recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The United States was one of the first country to recognize it, and all of a sudden, I mean, it didn't take root, but they literally tried to make it a part of their platform. They literally tried to remove the name God from being mentioned in their party platform. One of the keys to the United States' prosperity has been the way we've treated Israel. A managed press and an illiterate electorate. You remember you hear these people talk about the dumbing down of America? Okay? When you begin to dumb down the populace, when you begin to fill them full of propaganda, is what Hitler did. You can manipulate them to do all sorts of things. We need to learn from that. Okay. We're going to go on and get into chapter 11 right now. We're going to be in Romans 11 pretty much this whole month, and then when I come back, probably a few more weeks, because we're going to be dealing with some controversial topics in this chapter. I'm probably going to say some things that is going to challenge your understanding of the future of Israel. Some of you will agree with me, some of you won't. That's okay. Part of my goal is to challenge your thinking, because remember, you better remember that one of the things that I said that was a problem for Israel was that they had preconceived ideas as to how they thought Christ was supposed to appear. These preconceived ideas was one of the big hindrances to them being able to recognize the Messiah when he was in their midst. So when we're dealing with things to come, we need to always re-examine our preconceptions. Sometimes we're right. Sometimes when you examine your preconceptions, you find that you come to the conclusion you are right, but sometimes you have to modify. So as we continue this journey, as we go through this chapter, we're going to challenge some things. Now we're going to begin with Isaiah 65 verses 1 to 8, because it's going to kind of set up this 11th chapter for us. So in Isaiah 65, he begins, I sought of them that asked not for me. I am found of them that sought me not. I said, behold me unto a nation that was not called by my name. Who believes that the nation that he's talking to that is not called by my name is Israel? Got one person. Who believes that the nation is not called by name is referring to Gentiles? Okay? I challenge you that it's probably referring to both, Jews and Gentiles. Okay? nation that was not called by my name. I have spread out my hands all the day unto a rebellious people, which walketh in a way that was not good after their own thoughts. A people that provoketh me to anger continually to my face, that sacrificeth in gardens and burneth incense upon altars of bricks, which remain among the graves and lodge in the mountain and the monuments, which eat swine's flesh and broth of abominable things is in their vessels, which say, stand by thyself, come not near to me, for I am holier than thou. These are a smoke in my nose, a fire that burneth all the day. So let's begin Romans 11, verse 1. Paul begins, I say then, has God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, so he asks his questions. He knows that that Israel has done things that are disgusting to God. So he asks a question. Has God cast away his people? But this is a rhetorical question. The answer is, God forbid. No, he hasn't. Okay? In Greek, the question is asked to elicit a negative reply. In other words, it's somewhat rhetorical. God did not reject his people, did he? Okay, it's rhetorical. The mean genitive. It means by no means. Now, Paul makes this question. Has God cast away his people? And he's going to present some proofs that he has not. He begins with himself. I am, for I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. Okay? In Philippians 3:5, he said, he was circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of Hebrews, as touching the law of Pharisee. In other words, he is saying, I am, without a shadow of a doubt, a Jew. Okay? And God has not forsaken me. I say then, has God cast away his people? All right? Has God cast away his people? Paul said, we're saying, if God could save Paul, okay, if he could save him, he could save the other Jews. In fact, he could save you. So Paul begins in that second verse. God has not cast away his people which he foreknew. What ye not what the scripture saith Elias? So now he's going to talk about Elias. How he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying. Now he's quoting from 1 Samuel 1:22 and Psalm 94:14. That word, whom you foreknew, the prognostico, to have knowledge beforehand, it definitely has that, but it also has a deeper meaning. It means to have a meaningful relationship with. So it doesn't just mean to have foreknowledge, it means to have a meaningful relationship with. Now, God had chosen Israel as his covenant people from eternity past and endured into relationship with them that will never be destroyed. Now, Stifler points out that Israel is the only nation that God literally says he foreknew. Now, he says he foreknew some individuals, but I'm talking about a nation. This is the only one. Now, this is also the script, this portion is a reference to Amos 3:2. He says, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore, I will punish you for all your iniquities. You see, so you only have I known, referring to Israel. In Jeremiah, thus saith the Lord, if heaven above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all that they have done, saith the Lord. Now we know that this statement, this is why one of the reasons I'm putting this, because when you read something, you got to read the Bible in its total context. Okay? Because if you just read this, you would almost get the impression that he did cast them out, but he hasn't. So Paul's second proof that God has not rejected his people was taken from Israel's history during Elijah's ministry, and he's going to refer to the point in time where he was fleeing from his life from Jezebel. God hath not cast away his people, which he foreknew. Wot ye not what the scriptures say of Elias? How he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed thy prophets, and dig down thine altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. He was just whining and complaining because he was saying, I'm the only one left. God, there's no one left but me. Woe is me. He was quoting from 1 Kings. Elijah was having a pity party. He considered himself the only believing person left on earth. But what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Remember, there's always a remnant. There's always a remnant. God does not limit himself. And then during the time of Elias, he was not limited to one fearful, depressed prophet. He had reserved for himself a godly remnant in Israel that numbered about 7,000. Now, that may not be a great number. God doesn't need a great number, but there's always a remnant. The preservation of the faithful remnant was a work of God. In other words, God himself always keeps a group of people that he himself is preserving. So even then, at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. So Paul is saying that even during his day, there's a remnant set aside. God has not forsaken Israel. There's always I don't care how far away they seem to, as a nation, to move away from God, there's always a remnant. There's a remnant in Israel today. And it's according to the election of what? Grace. Paul was only one of many in his generation elected to faith from the people of Israel. The election of grace. Every generation of the church, a remnant chosen by grace, has been called among the Jews. Even today, there's a remnant. Paul continues. And notice he uses this word grace. And if by grace, then is it no more of works? Otherwise, grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then it is no more grace. Otherwise, work is no more work. Even when we come to this idea of God setting aside a group of Jews, same applies to the church. It is not because of anyone's works that they have done. It is a matter of God's grace. This also applies to our salvation. It is by grace. It doesn't apply to your gifts. It doesn't apply to your rewards. The gifts that you're going to receive once you are brought before the Bema seat. Okay? But your ticket to the New Jerusalem, to the new earth, is guaranteed. Because it's not by your works. We've gone through this over and over. In Romans 8, Paul said, nothing shall separate you. Okay? Nothing. That's the power of grace. When you depend on works, hope is gone, really. So in this passage, he emphasized the antithesis between grace and works. Verse 7, what then? Israel have not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election have obtained it, and the rest were blinded. That's a very powerful statement. Okay? Israel sought God. They were literally seeking God, but they failed to find him. Why did they fail to find him? Because they tried to do it by their own works. They tried to do it by saying that you can only walk so many feet, okay, on the Sabbath day. You can't eat corn. They had all these do's and don'ts. They were trying to find God through works, and they failed to do so. The Gentiles, on the other hand, were not looking, and they found him. How? By faith. They learned to trust, not what they themselves do, not their abilities, not what they, were able to accomplish for or against. It's just trust. You know, you can be sincere about serving God, but you know what? You can still be sincerely wrong, and we cover this in chapter 10, verses 1 to 4. The Jews zealously sought to be accepted by God on the basis of works and the righteousness of the law. However, they were not accepted by God. Only the elect were accepted because of God's sovereign choice by grace. The others were hardened. Paul continued, according as it is written, God has given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear until this day. What it means to be hardened is seen from Paul's explanatory and supporting quotations. They're taken from Deuteronomy and Isaiah and indicates that hardening involves spiritual drowsiness. That word slumber, or connexus, means a pricking or piercing, severe sorrow, extreme grief, insensibility, or torpor of mind, such as numbness resulting from a sting, blindness, and deafness. In other words, they were, numb. Okay? God had given them this spirit of slumber, this numbness, which kept them from being able to see and understand. Paul continues, verses 9 and 10, he said, and David saith, let their table be made a snare, and a trap, and a stumbling block, and a recompense unto them. Let their eyes be darkened, that they may not see, and bow down their back always. Now, the second quotation is from Psalms. In fact, Psalm 69 is the Psalms you really need to reread. I'm not going to go through it today. It predicts things that should have been the source of nourishment and blessing to Israel. And I'm referring to this verse as well. Because the occasion for the rejection of God, a snare and a trap, a stumbling block. That word table, it's not, when he's used a table, it's referring to all of their blessings from the hand of God. When you set a table, it's not so much that you're putting on, but you set the complete table. You put everything on there. Okay? And so he said, let their table, they have got all these blessings that they've got from God, and yet it's a snare and a trap and a stumbling block unto them. It should have led them to Christ, But it ended up doing just the opposite because they, one, had preconceptions, and two, they tried to do it under their own words. So they had to deal with God's judgment upon them. When he said bow down their back, because they refused to receive God's law, God's truth. Their backs will be bent under the weight of guilt and punishment because they refused to receive what God gave unto them. They didn't take the table. He goes on to verse 11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall, salvation has come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Again, the question in Greek was worded to elicit a negative answer. May it never be. Okay? So, did they fall? They did not stumble so as to fall permanently. Now, in the NIV, it kind of gives the impression that it was beyond recovery. Now, it could imply, okay, the tense of the verb, the contrast with the verb translated stumble, could imply the idea of falling beyond recovery, but that's not what it's saying. He's saying they did not stumble so far as to fall permanently, and he's giving himself as an example. He's giving Isaiah as an example, Elias as an example, okay? He's giving these proofs that here you have these situations where, you look at me. Look at Elias. He thought that the nation stumbled so far there wasn't nobody else, but God said, no, they haven't. They're still. Israel experienced not a permanent fall, but a stumbling. It saved at least two divine purposes. To offer salvation, that's not said, served at least two divine purposes. One, to offer salvation to the Gentiles. Two, to make Israel envious, literally to the provoking of them to jealousy. In Ephesians chapter 2, 11 and 13, it read, remember therefore that ye being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who were called uncircumcision by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh made by hands, that at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope without God in the world, but now in Christ Jesus, ye who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. Okay, so here we, as the Gentiles, being brought in. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. Now, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on this next week, because we are members of his body, of his flesh. But the failure, remember, the Jews' failure was a stumbling. It wasn't a complete failure. If you remember, I want to take you back, maybe if you remember the little video clip that I showed just before my last presentation. It wasn't just before, it was near the end of the last presentation. And I showed the interview with, I forgot, he was a White House correspondent who's a Christian. He wrote the book Eye to Eye. For some reason his name just is, but he was the author of the book Eye to Eye. Eye to Eye was a book where he documented how every time the United States did something against Israel, we met with disaster. Well, he had he had did several interviews with George W. Bush. He said that he is 100% convinced that George W. Bush is a Christian. So many Christians say, well, why did he treat Israel the way he did? Why did he do that? I'm going to tell you this in a minute. He said, why did he do that? And he said, because George W. Bush was raised and grew up in churches that rammed into his head over and over and over again that Israel, okay, has permanently lost their place with God and been replaced by the church. In other words, he had been indoctrinated into replacement theology. And therefore, that's why he made a lot of the decisions that he made. Not because he wasn't a Christian, but because he was indoctrinated in replacement theology. So that ties back into what we're discussing here. Israel has not permanently lost their place. They have stumbled, which allowed us to be brought in. We are members of his body. Paul continues on. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Now, he's asking this question again. Now, remember, this word diminishing is more numerical. Okay? And not all are rejected. So he's saying not all of Israel has been rejected. In other words, based on the grammar, they will be brought back. Okay? They will be coming into their fullness. Sometimes it's hard to get this information out of the way things are expressed when translated into the King James. So now, if all of them be riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentile, how much more their fullness? Okay, so Paul is saying this, they will be brought back. They will be coming into their fullness. He is not saying if they will be brought back. He's saying when they shall be brought back. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. Paul affirmed his special position to the apostles, to the Gentiles. In other words, he is saying, we all know Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. He knew he was the apostle to the Gentiles. Peter and the rest of the apostles knew he was the apostles to the Gentiles. However, despite the fact that Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, when you really read, you realize he really wanted to be in Peter's position. He wanted to be the apostle to the Jews. Okay? Even though a couple of times, there's actually three, in Acts 13, two of the instances are recorded, where Paul literally turned from unbelieving Jews to the Gentiles. And then the third incident was when he was in Rome in the 28th chapter, where he turned from unbelieving Jews to the Gentiles. But the other flip side of this is every time Paul tried to go to the Jews, okay, God would work it out that he had to go back. He would get rejected. He would get stoned. He would get thrown over a wall. All sorts of things would happen to him. Okay? If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them, okay? For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall be the receiving of them be but life from the dead? I'm going to skip some of it because I'm going to come back to it next week. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world and the diminishing of them, the riches of the Gentile, how much more? Right now, I'm going to do a contrast between chapter 12 and chapter 15, and I'm going to end it here. Next week, I'm going to come back to these points because I'm actually running out of time. So I'm going to come back to these points, and some of the things that I might have said not be too clear yet, just kind of keep a pin in your head, and I'll clear it up next week. But I want to end with a contrast between Romans 11:12, and I'm going to pick this up again in Romans chapter 15. He said, now if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them with the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For if the casting away of them be the reconciliating of the world, what shall be the receiving of them but life from the dead? And we're just going to quickly do a quick contrast, and we'll pick it up. In the 12th chapter, he talked about transgression, riches, and diminishing. In the 15th chapter, casting away, reconciliation, and life from the dead. Now, some equate life from the dead to Israel's acceptance of Christ, related to the first resurrection, the resurrection of life, and we're going to get into something very controversial next week, but we're going to end it right here. So, next session, we're going to continue with part 2 of Israel's future. And some of the parts that I kind of alluded to or didn't clarify near the end, I'll clarify next week. Amen? Dear Heavenly Father,